Welcome to Elevate and Thrive, Breaking Barriers for an Empowered Life. I'm your host, Jen Smith, and I am so excited to be on this journey with you. In this podcast, we are going to dive deep into the transformative stories of individuals who have faced adversity head-on, emerged stronger, wiser, and more empowered. I'm here to share those stories with you, to remind you that no matter how dark the night may seem, there is always light at the end of the tunnel, and there is a sunrise waiting to greet you. To inspire you to break through your own barriers, rewrite your own story, and to step into the light of your true potential. So what can you expect from Elevate and Thrive? Each week, I am going to bring you stories of triumph, resilience, and empowerment. We're going to explore the depths of the human spirit, spirituality, uncovering the courage and the strength that lies in each and every one of us. But more than that, we're going to provide you with practical tools, actionable insights, and a community of like-minded individuals who are also on this journey alongside you. So whether you're facing your own challenges or simply seeking inspiration to elevate your life, know that you have come to the right place. Together, we are going to break barriers, defy expectations, and soar to new heights. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey. I cannot wait to see where it takes us. Remember, you are worthy, you are enough, and your journey to an empowered life starts now. Thank you so much for being on this episode of Elevate and Thrive, Breaking Barriers for an Empowered Life. I'm Jen Smith. I am your host on this journey. Today, we have a really special guest who has been through a lot in her life and has learned how to turn it all around and really come out on the other side. My guest today is Margaret Roy. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Margaret. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being here. So I would love for you to just take us back to the beginning.
Well, I would have to say my earliest memory was when I was about 3 years old, maybe even a little bit earlier than that. I was born in 63, so around in 1966. And I remember little tidbits. We lived with my grandmother for a long time because my mother was a sole support for her family, basically, myself, my sister. My mother was a very, very young mother at age 15 and a half. She had her first child. I was born by the time she was 18, about 2 weeks before her 18th birthday. But I remember living in a place in Huntington Beach, and there was a lot of us, I think 7 of us. And then we moved to a place in Anaheim. And that was when I think my traumatic memories really began, was the Anaheim apartment that we lived in. We had a 2-bedroom, and it was my grandmother, my mother, my sister. I had an aunt, Vi, who lived there with her son, Chester, my uncle, Steve, who was only about 5 years older than me, and then my uncle, Harvey. And my abuse started then because my mother was gone many hours of the day because she was the sole support of our family. And at the time, she was only 21 years old. And I remember my uncle, Steve, being just a brute. He was just a terrible kid. I mean, 5 years older, but my grandmother allowed any kind of behavior from this kid. And he used to make my sister and I fight in the front yard. He would teach us how to box, and then we'd have to box each other. And my sister was 5 and I was 3 at the time. I remember being placed in a pile of ants when I was 3 years old, red ants, and they were biting my whole entire body. My sister was tied to a pole in the garage, and my uncle Steve lit a fire around her and began acting like an Indian. I mean, just crazy stuff, just really, really abusive situations. And my grandmother did nothing. He used to lock us in a room, and my grandmother would have to sneak us out the back window in, the summertime, if, we wanted to play in a little kiddie pool or something. So we got snuck out. My mother, I think we were there for probably about a year, maybe. We weren't there very long. And I think that's when my mother moved us out. And I have kind of lost memories from my life because we moved around a lot as children. Just we lived in a lot of different places. I think in total, I went to probably 8 different schools growing up. We were just never in one place for very long, except for when we moved to Harwood Street in the city of Orange. And we were there about probably 6 or 7 years. I think that was the longest stretch that I'd had in a home as a child. And during that time, my mother met a man who worked for my uncle by marriage. He was married to my Aunt Mary Frances. And this gentleman that my mother met worked for him at one of his mobile gas stations that he owned, my uncle's mobile gas station. And he became, part of our family. And my mother's boyfriend, he was about 20 years older than my mother. And so I think she felt secure with him because she'd never grown up with a father. We didn't have fathers. Sister and I had 2 different fathers, but neither were in our life. And so I think it was a security thing. And he moved in, and at age 6, he molested me first. I'm not sure if well, actually, I don't know that for a fact. He molested both of us. My sister was about 8 and I was about 6 years old. So I assume he was molesting both of us and making us touch him. It was never penetration, thankfully, because I always feel like there's so many people get raped as a child and you lose your virginity, and as an 8-year-old, it's even to me more horrific. Not that I'm, downplaying my situation or anybody else has gone through this, but for me personally, I always felt like that was better. Not better, but it could have been a lot worse. So we lived with him for a number of years. Children are molested. They place thing in box. You learn to compartmentalize things. So I placed my thing in a box for many, many years. And I really didn't think about it, but I was clearly a very troubled youth because of my upbringing. My mother was very hardworking. She worked from 7 in the morning till 11 at night for many, many years of our lives, probably anywhere from 8 to 10 years of our lives. And so she was gone a lot, which of course allowed freedom for this man who lived with us. And I know that she was, doing her best as a mother. It was a very difficult time in her life, had already grown up in a very difficult way with no father in her life and, having the burdens of taking care of a large family on her own. So I never blamed her for anything. It was what molded me as a person is how I always kind of looked at it. But by the age of 13, I was doing drugs. I began smoking pot. And so during this time, Louis, who was the man who was my mother's boyfriend, he ended up getting arrested when I was about 13 years old. And he was arrested for molesting a 13-year-old boy and for robbing a liquor store at gunpoint. So he went to jail. I watched him get hauled away in front of our home. And at that point, my mother could no longer afford her rental in Orange. So my Uncle Mike stepped in and said, "Hey, you can all move in with us." So he had been divorced from his wife, my aunt, and he had purchased a home in Orange. And so my mother agreed that we would all 3 move in, which we did. And this was probably by the time I was about 13 years old. We moved into his home. And at age 14, things seemed to be going well. But age 14, my mother had a nervous breakdown and she left the home when I was 14. She went into Brea, a psychiatric institution where she was held for about 3 weeks. And after she came out, she decided that she didn't want to live at Uncle Mike's anymore, that it wasn't a good situation, and that she would take on a small apartment in Santa Ana, closer to her work. And by this time, she was working in the medical legal field and workers' comp and with orthopedic surgeons. And so she had, a decent job. By this time, my sister was living with her boyfriend, and eventually who became the father of 2 of her children. And so I chose to live at home with Uncle Mike because I had all the freedoms in the world. It was a perfect situation for a teenager. So at age 14, my uncle lost his job. He was in the trucking business and lost his job and didn't know what he was going to do. So he began selling drugs. And I was probably his big biggest drug pusher that he had. Initially, it started out with marijuana. And by the time I was 15, it became cocaine. And we were selling very large amounts, like pounds in a week. I remember driving up to places like LA and meeting with big drug dealers. He would take me with him and counting thousands and thousands of dollars in the back room, of our house from the drug money that, he was bringing in. And I was pushing his drugs and doing his drugs and became very, very, very paranoid. I always maintained another job, a part-time job somewhere, usually in the restaurant business. And so I would do both. And I remained in his home until he lost it, I think when I was about 16 years old. And at that point, my mother was still living in Santa Ana. I was kind of bouncing around. I was literally couch surfing. My mother at one point said I could come back and sleep on her couch because she just had a little studio apartment. But I chose not to. I had too many freedoms as a teenager and I was independent. And so I chose to not go back to my mother's home. About a year went by after my uncle lost his home. And at age 17, I got caught shoplifting at a grocery store. No reason to shoplift. I had money in my pocket. I always had money in my pocket, but I always feel like to this day, this was my divine intervention. It makes me very emotional because I know it saved my life. Getting arrested that day was one of the most difficult days of my life, but it was the best day of my life because it scared me. It scared me straight. I was put in the back seat of a Santa Ana Police Department police car, hauled off to jail like I was a hardened criminal, fingerprinted, pictures taken. I mean, I couldn't even believe it. It's like, oh my gosh, it's like I'd murdered somebody. I stole ham and socks. Oh. That's what I took that day. But they treated me and it was their program that they had, which I was really grateful for. They had a 12-step program back then that they put these kids in that really needed to get off the streets. And so I was technically on the streets. I had places to lay my head at night, lived in hotel rooms. I lived at family's house. I lived at my uncle's house occasionally. I'd sneak in the bedroom window of my boyfriend's house, wherever I could find to lay my head. I did. So this 12-step program, my mother went through it with me because she was so devastated and felt so guilty about her daughter, what, had gone wrong with me. And so she did the 12-step program. And after I finished the program, my aunt had a nursing registry and she asked if I would come to work for her. And so I went to work for her as a manager and I worked with her for probably a year, and then her registry ended up getting closed down. But, a turning point in my life that I just will never forget it because it was so important to me. So I became still independent, no more drugs, never did another drug, never smoked any more marijuana. I just kind of started my life's journey at that point at 18. I was maintained a home for myself, lived with a boyfriend at age 18 in Yorba Linda. Family had a farm there. And I loved it, but he was super, super jealous. I ended up leaving him because I couldn't even come home from work for, 5 minutes late, and he was so jealous. And also that was when my childhood resurfaced. I remember him not being anything like, Louis, my mother's boyfriend, but for some reason my memories was jogged during that time. And so there was a night where I was taken to the emergency room. They thought I was actually having a heart attack because I had, such high blood pressure and heart palpitations. And they put a Holter monitor on me for a 24-hour period of time, discovered that it was complete anxiety and that it was time to deal with the childhood. So that's when I began my journey with therapy. Therapy was a lifesaver for me because everything poured out and everything for me got resolved. I was able to push through the feelings that I had, the feelings of, my lack of self-worth. Everything is your fault when you're a kid. That's just the bottom line. And I learned that in therapy, that everything is your fault, or that's how you feel.
We internalize it.
I internalized so many things. And letting it out was key to my survival. And I call it survival because it is survival. For some people, it just maybe they call it success, but I call it my survival in the way that I came out of it talking to somebody, and it wasn't always the right person. I changed many times until I found people that, made me feel comfortable, because you never do when you grow up that way. You never feel safe or comfortable. I still never really trusted men in my life because I had no real men in my life that treated me the way I should be treated. And so I didn't have a trust for men at all. I always trusted my mother, and I was always close to her and always loved her very much. And therapy actually allowed me to release any blame that I had for her, because I look back at it and I thought, gosh, my mother was a baby when she had me. She had two babies, and she was a baby. And, she had it pretty rough. So I took my mother's life into consideration of mine. And that's how I was able to forgive my mother, which was also key in my healing. And if I can tell anybody that, because I know a lot of people have mommy issues, what we call mommy issues, and it can be daddy issues as well.
Yep.
And I felt life was unfair for not having a father. I also felt like it made me who I am today. It made me strong. It broke cycles that I could have never broken. All of these things that I learned along the way, and the things that happened to me are, in my opinion, part of my journey. Nobody will ever understand why. For me, only God knows that. You do wonder when you're growing up, like, why would I be given this pain? Why would I have to go through this? Because you're born innocent, obviously. Those are things that crossed my mind. But therapy also helped me, I guess, rationalize and reconcile everything that had happened in my life. And I feel like because of it, I came out on top. I think we always suffer. Children of abuse always suffer to some degree. I've had a couple of therapists call it going back into the basement where you hide yourself. And we will always have that no matter what, but you can overcome it. I know that for a fact. I don't suffer from depression because of my childhood or any of the traumas that I had, even as an adult. It's all situational for me. Everyone in the world has situational depression. And that's something that I also learned in therapy, that I wasn't clinically depressed like my mother because I worried about it. My mother suffered from clinical depression and had to have treatment for it, and I never have. So I was also grateful for that I had a strong enough core where I could overcome any of the adversities in my life and the traumas in my life and still be able to get up in the morning, which many people can't.
Sounds like therapy and that divine intervention, that moment where you did the shoplifting and you were taken in that program. Absolutely. It sounds like that was like,
yeah,
intervention. It was like, okay, now we're going to go a different direction. And you chose that, because I think that's the other thing that's so important in all of this. What I'm hearing in your story is we have a choice how we are going to process these things that happen to us and these traumas. And in that moment, you were given an opportunity to go in a different direction and you chose to do it. And I would imagine that it was not an easy road, especially if you were really addicted to drugs. And I would imagine that that was really a hard road to walk to get on the other side of it. And then even going to therapy to keep going and keep trying. Because I heard you also say that you went through several people throughout this time.
I did.
Yeah. And so to keep trying different people, it sounds to me that there was this underlying, I'm not going to give up on myself. And there's this underlying inner strength you found.
Well, I think inner strength is something that you're born with. That's how I feel. I think it's something that God blesses you with. And I think I've always been blessed with it. And if I hadn't been, I wouldn't have been able to do the things that I did. I think my mother was blessed with it because I watched a mother, for many, many years take care of children on her own with no father, with no financial help. She had to work very hard for it. But I think that it came from that. It came from maybe DNA. I just had it. I have been told by two different therapists that I have a strong core. Those were the terms that they used for me, that I have a strong core. And I don't necessarily have ever really thought about where it comes from, except for that you're either blessed with it, it's either handed down from someone. Watching my mother struggle all those years was probably had a hand in it. I think the other part was that by the time I hit age 20, I never really had any true goals in my life because it was never nurtured as a child because my mother didn't have time to nurture any goals. I didn't think about becoming a doctor or anything like that. I just never really had any true goals. And it was the path I was on that caused me not to have any, obviously. And then the fact that goals were not nurtured. So children learn, with what they live. I believe in that saying. I always have. I used to actually have it on my refrigerator, when I became a mother. It was posted on my refrigerator because it was a reminder for me to be a better parent and to break the cycles in my family that were pretty brutal. I mean, my sister never had the core that I had. She never escaped it. And from what I understand, still to this day, I don't speak to my sister who I grew up with. She always hated me as a child. She hated me as an adult. It was very apparent to me. And, that was sad for me because we could have been allies. The same thing happened to us. As far as your question is concerned, I think you're born with it. I think that, yes, it becomes, part of my life. By age 20, I started dreaming. I was an adult now, dreaming of what my life would look like and how I could make it better. And I wanted so badly to be a parent. I really did. I wanted to always be a mother. I always thought, oh, I would have 4 or 5 kids. That's just what I always dreamed of. And I met my first husband at age 21, and we were married when I was 26. I had my first child, my only child, at 27, my son Eric. That changed my life in many ways. Knew, even though I had this child with this man, that I'd chosen the wrong man for myself. I really didn't know any better. I was young and I wasn't thinking, of myself. And I didn't feel like he ever treated me the way I wanted to be treated. So we did end up divorcing when I was about 30. He was still very active in my son's life. I made it a point that he was. I nurtured their relationship because I grew up without that father and I didn't want my son to grow up without his. So again, it's just the will, and it started, dreaming. I became involved in the same industry my mother was in, so I followed in her footsteps, and that was a good move on my part because I was able to raise my son at home. There was no way my kid was going to be a latchkey kid like I was. So I chose at that point to give up a career because at this point I started thinking of the law. I really love the law. And I thought I would become an attorney. But I also knew that if I did, it would be many years of school and years of, being outside of the home. So I chose to stay in the medical legal profession. And I worked as soon as my son was born, I was working at home full time. And that was my choice. Literally, like my last day was a Friday. My son was born on a Saturday. And I never went back to full-time work in an office or outside of the home. I was always at home. So again, it was choices and a will to make a better life for myself, make a good life for my son. And that was super important to me. I did go back full circle at some point. My uncle, who gave me the drugs to sell as a kid, it was after Eric was born. Eric was probably about 3 or 4, and my ex-husband and I were already divorced. My uncle decided that he would pick up the drugs again and start selling. He wasn't a user, but he picked them up and started selling and spent 5 years in federal prison. And after that happened, I was still close with him. And so we moved into his home. My son and I moved into his home in Lake Forest before he came home, set up his home for him. And we lived there for about 3 years before I moved on and purchased my own home in Yorba Linda. It was happy times for us when we came back. When Uncle Mike came back, it was different. It's like everybody had learned their lessons. My uncle, a giant kid, he learned like, okay, never want that to happen again. And of course, I was a mother now, so your priorities just seemed to change, or at least they did for me. And it was all about, making money, a nice home, a good roof over his head, sending him to the best schools, and being a mother, going on vacations. everything that I never got, my son got for sure. So that was another part of that question, is the will to make a better life for your child that you didn't have. It was just the most important thing to me ever.
I can relate to that in my own way because I was a young mom. I had two
Mhm.
kids by the time I was 23. And so,
Young.
yeah, yes. And also, I had a lot of traumas in my life as well. I feel the same in the way with my mom. It's like I look back at the things that she went through, and
Yeah.
I don't blame her for anything that happened.
No.
At the same time, those experiences happened to us. And so,
Yes.
navigating through that, finding forgiveness, choosing, and
Yes.
I've heard you say that so many different times throughout your story. It was like the choices that you made, you chose differently. And at a point, you chose to turn your life around. And so everything built off of that next choice. It was like, okay, here's another one. And we do have free will. I think when it comes down to us going through these really difficult times in life, we have a choice of how we're going to handle what comes,
Hmm.
because we can't always choose or control what happens to us. I mean, it
No,
happened hard sometimes to wrap your brain around.
it is.
Me, I can relate to what you're saying in that I chose to break the cycle, do it different for my kids. And they were my reason, they were my why, they were what gave me that willpower to push on in those moments when I was exhausted and had felt like I had nothing left in me. And it was like, no, but
Yes.
I have to do this for them. We have this opportunity to, like you said, break the cycle with them and do it differently or not. And it all comes down
Right.
to choice.
Even though my mother never really left me, probably until I was, 14, I suffered from abandonment because she was gone so often. And those choices I couldn't make for myself. Those are choices she had to make, but she also had to support us. And as I got older, I understood that. Like, as a kid, I didn't, and I had a great relationship. I loved my mommy. My mommy was my mommy. That's just how it was, and I didn't know any better. And my sister blamed my mother for everything, the childhood trauma, molestation, for leaving home with him. Back then, it was taboo. Parents didn't talk about it. It wasn't like it is now. Things are different. People are more open, and they recognize that this was taboo. And I think I recognize that it's important to talk about it, because people have asked me many times, oh gosh, you don't have to talk about that. If I can help one person, then I will talk about it, because it's something that really never goes away. It's like you said, it's to process it in a certain way. And I'm probably have not always processed it correctly. I know for a fact it's affected my life, some negative, some positive. That's part of life. Negative and positive is part of life. That's just how it is. And it made me realize that I could have a whole life, and my son could have a whole life and a good life, regardless of what happened to me as a child. So it is definitely choice
Yeah.
and will.
I'm a trauma informed coach, and I've also experienced trauma myself. And so this is something
Mhm.
is near and dear to my heart. I have heard so many people's stories of going through these hardships and these hard things. There is seems to be this turning point where we are able to look at these hard, horrible things that have happened and look through the pain and say, you know what? Because I went through this, I can now help this person. Or because I went through this, it's like you said, sharing your story. It's like these things happened. You can't change it. But the fact that you're willing to share your experiences to help somebody else, to me, that gives that pain a purpose. And
It
that's
does.
yeah, and that's the entire reason for this podcast, actually, is to give our stories a voice so that it might be able to help somebody else going through pain or having their own experience,
Right.
own ways. I don't think it's for nothing.
It's not for nothing. It will resonate with someone
Yeah.
out there. And, part of my story, and I think I mentioned to you in our message going back and forth, was what I was talking about, going back into the basement. I was a very, very healthy, happy person with a successful business, raising my son. Despite everything that happened to me as a child, I pushed through, got ready to buy my second home that I'd owned, and I met my second husband. I consider him my project husband. He had nothing when I met him. He was working in an auto parts store making $400 a week. I paid off about $10,000 worth of his debt so that we could purchase the house together. We ended up getting married. We were what I considered very happily married for many years. And I built him a $130,000 recording studio because that was his dream. 5 years in, I supported him for 5 years into our marriage. After 5 years, he got into LAPD. I got him through a brutal academy, worked my tail off till all hours of the night, still running my business. At this point, we had bought the store he had worked in, the auto parts store, because he wanted to own it and his boss had died. So we bought that. I mean, it was just crazy stuff. And he mentored a 14-year-old girl and ended up having an affair with her. And we don't know the age he had the affair. She claims it was when she was 20, is what she told me, but it sent me on my tailspin. I literally, everything that I'd ever worked for was gone. He left me penniless. I lost homes. I had a home in Norco. I had a home in Yorba Linda. I lost everything that I had ever worked for. So that was another turning point that it was just like, you were going backwards now. It's like, oh my gosh, what happened? What happened to me? And so I had to come out of it not once, but twice. And the second time I came out of it was different. My son was grown. I didn't have the purpose that I had the first time. So it was much, much, much more difficult. And has taken years and therapy on and off in, what do they call it? EMDR therapy, all of these things to get rid of, the trauma because he was the first and only man I ever trusted. And once again, he destroyed my trust. So you have times where everything is great, and then all of a sudden it can be gone in a minute. And again, I feel like there's a purpose. Because once again, even though this time was even more difficult than overcoming childhood, my son was still in my life, obviously, but I wasn't raising him anymore. He's a grown person now. So it became so different for me. And I think that meeting my current husband, he's my third husband, I'm his third wife, and his two daughters helped to give me another purpose because they were with us full time, living at home. And I felt like for many different reasons, I was brought into their life for a good reason, to teach them something and to have, somebody like me who has overcome many obstacles in their life to, again, brighten their future. So once again, what you say, it's never without a reason, ever. And some people might lay down and say, oh, yes, no, this is so unfair. Life is not fair. But life isn't easy and life isn't fair. We have to make it what we want it.
I agree. We have these ups and downs in life. I talked a little bit in the first episode of this podcast about my story and this transition that I went through. I call it my life purge back in 2019. It was like the life that I knew changed. It was wild, but I can relate to you because I was a young mom. That time period of life, my kids were venturing out on their own. My son was in high school and then quickly kind of went out on his own as well. And so I can relate to that in that what they were when they were younger, like the reason that got me through all of this, like
exactly.
late nights, early mornings, and lack of sleep and trying so hard to make a better life for them. And then when you don't have that they're off on their own, like spread their wings and they've flown out of the nest now, it's like, okay, well, now what's my reason? It took me about 1.5 to 2 years after this major life shakeup to realize that I had to be my own reason. And it was a journey to get there. And so it was this process of learning how to love myself and give myself what I need and to be the reason that I keep moving forward and I keep trying.
Yes.
And that, I think, was really part of the purpose. I mean, there were other reasons that all of those hard things happened again for me.
Yes. Yes.
Can you relate to that?
Completely. Absolutely. And this time around, I think because the first time around it was my purpose was my son, but this time around it was about me and getting what I wanted out of life and not feeling selfish about it because I think people, and it sounds like you have what I call a servant's heart. I've always had a servant's heart. I've always wanted to take care of everybody. And I think I obviously got that from my mother because my mother took care of everybody. I watched her do that for many years, and I feel like I inherited from her. And so now I think, okay, I can still take care of people, but hello, you can still take care of yourself. One of the things that was a turning point for me in my life too was at age 45, I met my birth father. And I saw all the DNA that I had wondered about for so many years, like because I've always dreamed being a horse person. I got my first horse when I was 42, and I was always horse obsessed as a kid.
Same.
And I didn't really know where it came from. My mother's the city slicker, so it wasn't from her. And I knew that my birth father was raised on a dairy farm, but he had been a horse person his whole life since he was a child. That helped piece some things together because I had so many, missing pieces of my puzzle. And that was my biggest piece that was missing out of my life. So that helped piece it together. And I did get to meet him about 4 times in my life. And I have 4 sisters on that side, 2 of which I have relationships with. It's taught me that this doesn't have to be about everybody else. You can also make it about yourself. And so I have learned to be more about me and do all of the things that I do for people that I love doing for people and taking care of people. But I can also take care of me, and it's okay. And I definitely learned that the second time around with, the brutal divorce and the trauma that caused me. And part of that trauma was he basically groomed this girl. He's an officer of the law, and he groomed somebody for many years and then married her. So it was just like, whoa, how did this come about? That trauma in my life made me think of, you don't have to give it all up. You don't have to give every little single thing of yourself to someone to make that person happy. They should be happy with just who you are as a person. And I definitely learned that for sure. It took me a long time because I'd taken so many steps backwards after, what happened to me in the divorce that I did have to relearn it. And now I get it. Now I totally get it. And again, a lot of therapy and making the right choices. I had one therapist who was a total woman hater or man hater. And I went to one session. I thought, nah, she's not the one for me because I don't hate men. That's not what of this. It's to heal me, not to become a man hater like her. That's not what this was about because not every man is bad. And I know that I'm married to a good man, who's loyal and qualities that I want in a man. So, you can't say it about everybody.
And I agree. And I want to touch on a couple things that you said. First of all, just that looping back to what you just said about that therapist that was a man hater. I do coaching for a living. I'm a trauma informed coach. I believe in finding people that can help you navigate these things to heal. And
Yes.
so I'm a huge, huge believer in that. And there's so much value in that. But also, not everybody that does these different modalities has taken the time to heal themselves. And
Right.
I see that a lot in the field of work that I do. We have the horse thing in common.
Yes.
I have horses, but I
Right.
spent 4 years in horse rescue. And one of the things that I noticed about a lot of people, and this isn't true for everybody, but I noticed it, is that a lot of people that run animal rescues, oftentimes are the ones that need the rescuing themselves. And so they,
100%.
yeah, yeah. And it's,
Dog rescue.
yes. And it's
Absolutely.
very, very similar to what I'm seeing in different therapy, healing modalities. It's so important to find somebody that you resonate with and not just
Mhm.
go because the insurance pays for it. Because you can go for years and really not make much progress in your healing journey.
Right. Well, that happened to my sister, the therapist that I went to with her. She had been with for 10 years, and she was clearly just taking her money because immediately I recognized that she was all about making my sister feel better for herself, for her purpose of collecting her money. And it really wasn't helping my sister. I mean, 10 years with the same therapist, if you don't have any kind of evolution after 10 years or any kind of healing after 10 years, there's something wrong with your therapist.
Or
And
it could not be the right therapist for you. So, I
yes.
because we all resonate for different reasons.
Mhm.
There might be nothing wrong with her methodology or her modalities or whatever she's doing.
Yes.
Just be that they weren't a match, what she needed.
Yeah, I have after having so many therapy appointments and talking to so many different people, though, we always kind of have a joke that I could be a therapist because now I have a high psychological IQ, I guess you could say, because not only just that, but because I was a medical legal field for many years and I reviewed medical records and took medical legal histories and I learned a great deal from taking people's histories, including psychological histories that I took and all different kinds that I worked in. But I just think for my own thing, having the therapy in my life, I learned about the psychological world. And I mean, I know psychology with books. And I remember walking into this therapist's office with my sister and almost immediately knowing that she had a motive of some sort. And I felt like it was my sister's money because my sister was paying her cash for many, many years. And, cash is king. I've learned to go with my gut feelings because in the past I have ignored them and they're almost always right. And maybe it is because I am psychologically in tune, because of my past, because of my history of having hundreds of therapy appointments, or it's just who I am, as a person, but I can get it. I mean, I knew immediately ex-husband was having an affair. I felt it. And I spoke to him about it. And of course, it was denied, but my gut was right. And so I tend to go with my gut when I walk into therapists. It's the same thing. I mean, I had a recent therapist and I'm not seeing him anymore because my insurance changed, but I was like instantly drawn to him. I instantly tell this guy, first off, I chose him. He was a Christian man. I chose him for that reason, but I also chose him because he had worked with a lot of veterans. He knew PTSD, and that was my diagnosis. And that's another thing I think people don't understand about somebody like us who have had the trauma. People don't call it PTSD. They think if you get your leg blown off in the war, it's PTSD, which it is. But they don't think these other things like child molestation, abandonment, having bad men in your life who gives you drugs to sell when you're a baby, they don't think that's PTSD. And in fact, they're incorrect. It is definitely PTSD. And that's why we have to continually work through it. And I'll be working through this the rest of my life, I'm sure of it. Understanding the psychology has also helped me, overcome.
Tapping into that intuition, like you just said,
Yes.
following your gut, tapping into the intuition. And I think that's so important just in general for people to do.
Yes.
I feel like when we really start to listen, our gut, our intuition, our whatever you want to call it, it knows. Like we get that
Yeah.
spidey senses and we're like, something's not right in the situation. And very rarely, if ever, actually, like looking back on my life, has there been a time where I had one of those feelings and it didn't
And
turn
we're
out to
wrong.
be
Exactly.
true?
Exactly.
And there's been times where it hasn't necessarily been confirmed, but I chose to
Mhm.
listen to it anyway because I've learned
Yep.
over the years, trust that feeling, trust your gut. And that comes back to trusting ourselves. And
Exactly.
oftentimes when we are in these really turbulent situations growing up, that can be really hard to do because one of the things that happens is we lose or maybe never even learned, this self-worth, this self-trust.
Yeah.
Like
It's
it's
our self-confidence to believe something about yourself when you don't have self-confidence. It's almost impossible for most to actually believe, when you lack that self-confidence.
and just finding little ways to reaffirm yourself, reaffirm, say,
Hmm.
hey, you know what? I was right on with that feeling, or finding little ways to reaffirm, I know what I'm talking about here.
Yeah.
And rebuilding that confidence, like you said, and learning how to trust yourself, I think is so, so important. What do you hope people will take away from hearing your story today? If there's a message that you could give people of inspiration or hope or anything else, what would you like to say to the listeners as the takeaway today for, being on this journey with us?
I would have to say that everyone has value, and you have to dig deep sometimes for that value, your self-value. But everyone has it. If you're a good-hearted, kind person, you have something to give this world. But first, give it to yourself, because that old saying, if you can't love yourself, you can't truly love anyone else, is a very true saying. And I would say to them, just keep digging deeper and deeper and deeper until you find it. Go to therapy, go to your church, go to your pastor or your friends. I mean, your girlfriends, whoever they are. Open up your heart and be okay with talking about it, because it makes you a better person. I have no trouble and have never had any trouble sharing my story. It came later with my mother when I was at age 18 and a half, 19, for the first time. It broke her heart, but I knew it had to be done. But it made our relationship stronger. So sharing your journeys and your stories, good or bad, is so, so important. And I think also, don't sit around and feel sorry for yourself. We've all had pity parties. I've had many of my own. I used to have a friend who used to tell me, you see the world through rose-colored glasses. And it was annoying to her, by the way. But I said, I don't care. It's how I survive. Find what makes you happy. And I'm not talking about taking care of people or taking care of your children. Find something that actually honestly makes you happy as a person, and take it and run with it and share that with the world. Because once you open up those doors for yourself, your life will be so different. Trust me, my life is not perfect, but I've gone on to be an entrepreneur. I've owned several businesses. I own my own real estate brokerage. I own Horse Camping Caterer, which many people know about and join me on these wonderful journeys and trips. Um, Having the therapy has opened up so many doors for me. My imagination, which I never knew I had an imagination when I was growing up, it was never nurtured. So I learned to nurture those things myself. Don't count on anybody else to do it. I can tell the listeners, don't count on anybody else. Count on yourself, because really the bottom line is this is about us and about our journey. And yes, we take these other people along the way, but it's really about us and ourselves. Always remember to keep that in mind, that if you make yourself happy, then you can make others happy. But we have to come first in that. And it's something that I took years to learn, but I do believe it starts with us. It starts with our hearts and with our souls. And once we get that right, then we can share so many things with the world. And I mean, this is a perfect example. You and I sharing our stories with the world, as painful as it is, it has to be done, because if we help one person, that's what it's about. And I think that other people need to learn that too, is that if you share, it will help someone, I guarantee you. I know I've already helped people with this.
It gives purpose to the pain.
Purpose to the pain. I love that saying. And also a saying that I just told somebody this the other day, saying I've heard many, many times, what you resist will persist. So don't ever resist your feelings, your need to share them or anything, because they just get hidden and internalized, and they never, ever go away because of it.
Thank you so much. I love I love all the things that you said. Thank you for sharing your story with us, for giving those takeaways to the listeners. And I just really appreciate you. And I'm sending so much love to you on your
Thank
continued
you.
journey of healing.
Same goes to you as well. Everything happened for a reason.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Margaret, so much for being with us
You're
today.
welcome.
All right.
It was so nice meeting you,
Nice.
kind of in person.
Kind of.
Kind of. Take care, Jen. Thank you.